Well, good afternoon. My name is Andy Rethal with Lumina Compliance, and we're really excited for you to join us today to cover our Series 2 of our webinars, our federal accessibility laws and the low-income housing tax credit, and pertaining to properties that are funded under the LIHTC program. Today, the Lumina Compliance team focuses on asset management, ADA, Section 504, and fair housing compliance, capital needs assessments, as well as file reviews. Our team has provided more than 15,000 physical inspections for management companies, owners, housing authorities, and syndicators, as well as investors over the years. I'm going to introduce Greg Proctor. He's our founder and CEO of Lumina Partners. Greg has more than 40 years of experience in the affordable housing industry and has owned and operated all types of affordable housing, including HUD, tax credit, and rural development properties. Heck, I'm about to turn 40 this month, and I'm not sure I was even born when Greg got started in this business. But
that's a little rude.
I promise you, he is one of my greatest mentors in this business. I've learned a tremendous amount, and we are so excited to be able to pass that along to you through our series here. I think he's going to do a fantastic job in our presentation today. So, Greg, with that, I'll hand it over to you and let you take it away with your expertise.
Well, thank you, Andy. And so there's a lot of misconception when we're talking about accessibility at tax credit properties. You'll see a lot of confusion about how the regulations are applied, what regulations apply to a property. And so we're going to get into that today over the next few minutes. So as I was saying, there are different regulations and laws that apply to tax credit properties depending on when the property was built and whether they have federal subsidy. So we'll get into the three major areas where we are going to be dealing with the accessibility regulations for LIHTC properties. First of all, we had the Fair Housing Act of 1968. That act was amended in 1988 to include familial status and disability. Obviously, the disability part of it is what we're going to be covering today. We also have the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. That was created and implemented in 1990, and that's for public accommodations. We'll get into a little bit more of that, but public accommodations are different than dwelling units. So we'll talk about that further. Now, we also have Section 504. If your property is has some HUD layering or rural development layering, then there is going to be potential for that to be covered by Section 504. We're not going to talk a whole lot today because most tax credit properties were built after 1991, and so we're going to focus a lot on the Fair Housing Amendments Act. Most of the tax credit properties, majority of them are conventional, but there are some HUD and RD properties that we'll talk about as well. So as you can see, at a tax credit property, you could be only falling under the Fair Housing Amendments Act. You could be only falling under the Fair Housing or Section 504. But you also, if you have a public accommodation like a parking area or a office, you're going to be covered under ADA. So it intertwines, and that's why it's important to understand how these laws interact. Now, one of the big things I want to talk about first and foremost is that on tax credit properties only, there is a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Justice, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and the IRS or Treasury, in that they are going to be working together to make sure that there are not non-compliance at the properties and how they're going to report those. So the key issue there is that HUD and the Department of Justice are the ones that are responsible for determining if a property is out of compliance with fair housing laws. So a charge by the secretary, a probable cause finding from a state or local ordinance, a lawsuit filed by the Department of Justice, and then a settlement consent decree from HUD and Justice, and between them and the owner, are all going to have the going to cause that property to be in hot water. So with that, the Department of Justice and HUD, or a state agency, is going to find that issue of non-compliance. When the state agency determines there has been a report of non-compliance with the Department of Justice or HUD, they are obligated by the IRS to immediately submit an 8823 for the property. As each of you in the tax credit business are well aware, 8823s are something you don't want to have. So the issue then becomes that you have an 8823, which is not a good thing to have, and you're going to have a situation where you could have a recapture of tax credits if those items are not corrected. So let's talk a little bit about specifically what major laws apply to your property. The Americans with Disability Act, ADA, covers public accommodations. It doesn't cover dwelling units. It doesn't cover areas of the property that aren't open to the general public, but it does cover areas that are open to the general public. And typically where you see public accommodations or in the leasing office or community space, if you rent that community space out to the general public. The thing that you want to be aware of is that your property has to be in compliance. Your office has to be compliant. And in this example, you've got properties that were tax credit properties that were built within the last 15, 20 years that are in pretty good shape from a compliance standpoint. But there are things that can cause those properties to be out of compliance. And this is a perfect example of that. You've got an accessible water fountain. You've got accessible bathrooms in the back there with the proper signage. But someone has put a table there that obstructs the 36-inch clear opening into those bathrooms. So you've got to be aware that sometimes things that you do and things you place in a clear path or accessible route are going to cause it to be out of compliance. But primarily, I want to talk about parking. Van accessible parking is required for public accommodations. So a van accessible space is required, obviously, for the office and for a community room that's open to the general public. Now, this is a brand new property. It looks like the van accessible space is the right width. However, there is no van accessible signage. So you have a situation at a tax credit property where someone could drive on your property, not get out of their car, and determine that you are in non-compliance with accessibility regulations. With a van accessible space, the thing to be kind of understanding about van accessible spaces is that effectively they have to have signage, and the access aisle needs to be 8 feet wide instead of the typical 5 foot wide access aisle that you see on regular parking, accessible parking spaces. So you need to be aware that you are going to be under Americans with Disabilities Act in those areas. Now, the main area that tax credit properties are going to be dealing with is the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. The Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 says that as properties built after March 13th, 1991 must meet these 7 design requirements, and we'll talk about each one of those. The 7 design requirements are, obviously, the buildings have to be on an accessible route. The general or the common and public areas have to be in compliance and on an accessible route. And so just right there, your common areas and your public areas are going to overlap with the Americans with Disability Act. They're going to be, you'll be responsible for meeting that in both cases. But if you meet one, you're typically going to meet the other. You must have usable doors, and usable doors means that you have a 32-inch clear opening that someone that is mobility impaired can get through that door. The door frames have to be a certain width as well, and then you must have thresholds that are in compliance. And then once you get into an accessible unit, you have to, or an adaptable unit, you have to be on an accessible route throughout the covered unit. On top of that, light switches, thermostats, all those kind of things need to be within proper reach ranges and accessible. Then you must have reinforced walls for grab bars in the bathrooms. And then, of course, usable kitchens and bathrooms. Now, in the tax credit side of things, you don't have to necessarily have completely accessible units, but you have to have these 7 design features. And we'll talk about each of these 7 design features and how they can cause you a heartache when you don't meet them. So the pictures that I have here today are actually pictures from self-evaluation and transition plans that we've done over the last couple of weeks for tax credit properties. So these pictures are from tax credit properties built after 1991. So the Fair Housing Amendments Act is applicable to these properties. So here we are at a property that is fairly new, and there is not an accessible route to this building. There needs to be some sort of curb cut to get to this building, and there is not one to this building. You only have to have one to each building, but you must have an accessible route. Now, another thing to be aware of when you're talking about the design features is every single first floor unit must be fall under these 7 design features. And then if you have a building with an elevator, then all units need to be covered under the 7 design features. Now, in the industry, we typically call those adaptable units. Those aren't necessarily totally accessible units, but they have to be adaptable. And so we're going to talk about how that can apply to your property. Obviously, we've got van accessible parking, but we also have to have accessible parking for the dwelling units. In this situation, obviously, handicapped parking spaces are required, and they have to be on an accessible route. In this case, at this fairly new tax credit property, you can see where this striping or blue markings have faded away, and therefore it's hard to determine whether this is a accessible parking space. This is a very interesting one that is something to be very aware of. As you see there, that is technically where the accessible route into the office is. And they've got a nice curb cut there. But the problem is, as you can see, a car, that is actually my rental car, actually can block that accessible route by parking there. So you must have an accessible route or an access aisle so somebody can use that. On top of that, there is no accessible parking sign, and there is no van accessible parking signage as well, because this is a unit or a building that is under ADA, because it's the office. You need to be also aware that protruding objects need to be protected. And what you have here is under a stairwell. And we see that quite often at properties where there is nothing to prevent somebody that is visually impaired to hit their head on the bottom of the stairs as they're walking out of their unit. So you need to have some sort of cane detection like you saw in the previous slide, so that someone that is visually impaired does not hit their head on the bottom of the stairway. Common areas must be on an accessible route as well. And as you can see here, this is the laundry facility. And as you can note, the threshold into that laundry is quite a bit higher than 1/2 inch change in elevation. So this laundry facility is not in compliance with the regulations. Playgrounds are part of the areas in an accessible route. And in this case, you can see that it's on an accessible route, but the ramp going into the playground is not doing its job, and there's a change of elevation significantly higher than 1/2 inch. Now, one thing to understand, with the current regulations, playgrounds themselves don't have to have accessible matting or anything at this point, but you do have to have an accessible route to a playground. Laundry rooms, as I was mentioning before, need to be on an accessible route, and front-loading wash machines are needed because somebody that is mobility impaired is going to have a very difficult time reaching down to the bottom of a top-loading wash machine. As you can see in this property, there is no front-loading wash machine, so therefore it's out of compliance. One thing to be aware of, though, is with these properties, most of them use a outsourced vendor for wash machines and dryers. So all you really need to do is insist that your vendor provides you with a front-loading wash machine. Dumpsters should be on an accessible route as well. And in this case, at this property that we inspected last week, the lids going into the dumpsters are over 54-inch side reach range. So they are not in compliance. Mailboxes are another area that we find a lot of issues of non-compliance on tax credit properties. It's simply because the mail slots are handled by the post office and are installed without thoughts about where accessible units or households with mobility impairments might have their mailboxes. So any mailbox for an accessible unit or a unit where there is mobility impaired residents need to be below 54-inch side reach range so they can actually access their mailbox. Doors through accessible routes can be 32-inch. So you go from a 36-inch clear opening or clear path on an accessible route, and it can go down to 32 inches. Now, 32 inches is not the size of the door. You'll hear people talk about 32-inch doors. However, when you put the door on there, then it's going to drastically reduce the width of that door from frame to the door, the side of the door. So in many cases, those are quite significantly below 32 inches and out of compliance. So you'll see that quite often on tax credit properties. Now, this is one of the other things I was talking about earlier about being on an accessible route. Doors should have very low or no thresholds. Now, in this case, you have an architect that decided he was going to be a little fancy and put a little gravel strip, and it's attractive looking. However, it is not accessible to somebody that is mobility impaired. Thresholds into accessible units as part of requirement 4 need to be less than 1/2 inch change in elevation. And as you can see here, this unit is not in compliance with the regulation as it relates to thresholds. Thermostats and controls should be in proper reach range. So the proper reach range is less than 48 inches if you are approaching that threshold from a forward reach. If you have a clear opening of 30 by 48 inches to the side, then you can actually have that thermostat, which is typically down a hallway, be up to 54 inches in height. Now, the problem here and why so many tax credit properties find themselves out of compliance with thermostats is thermostats are put in place by a contractor that probably has no understanding of the requirements of the Fair Housing Amendments Act, and so therefore putting them where they are most energy efficient. So in this case, it is quite a bit higher than 48 inches because you can only approach it from a forward reach range, and therefore it's out of compliance. Reach ranges, and there's some figures or illustrations that show you what those can be. And so you need to make sure that your thermostats, your switches, your outlets are all within the proper reach ranges. There's your side reach range. There's your requirements for blocking in your bathrooms, especially in the showers. And where we find this most often in newly built accessible tax credit properties is there's not been blocking in the shower/tub. And the way we can determine that is all you have to do is beat your fingers against the side walls, and you can tell that there is no blocking for potential handles and grab bars that are needed in order to make an adaptable unit accessible. And so, as I was saying, that you don't have to have accessible units, but you do have to have adaptable units that meet these 7 design features. So if you don't have blocking in the walls behind the tubs and toilets and showers, then you're out of compliance. Pretty easy to find that out when you go to your own properties. And then there also has to be clear space for maneuvering in the bathroom and in the kitchen. And in this case, there is not clear space, brand new property, and there's not clear space to get into the bathroom area of this property. So it is out of compliance. Clear space in the kitchen is important. For the most part, this kitchen is in compliance, but the range, there is not a 30 by 48 inch clear opening in front or beside that range. So you have an issue of non-compliance there. Now, I'm sure we have some questions, but just wanted to kind of run those kind of things through you to realize that there are areas of non-compliance as your property, I can assure you. I have been to thousands of properties, and probably half of those are tax credit properties, and I've yet to find a single property that's completely in compliance with the regulations that are in place for the property. So it's very, very important that you understand these regulations and make sure that you are able to determine what's out of compliance, and you have a plan to get those back into compliance. So Andy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Perfect. Well, Greg, really appreciate it. Some great examples there. Most recently, I know from your travels the last few weeks. We do have some questions. We're going to try to hit as many of those as possible. So we have one that came in from the attendees. How are the costs associated with accessibility improvements allocated within the LIHTC project? So that's the first part of that question. And how can developers optimize these allocations to benefit both accessibility and tax credit benefits?
Well, that's a very good question. So once the property is built, you already have your eligible basis and determined, and so you're not able to go in after the fact and create more eligible basis and qualified basis at a property. So that's a good question. But the second part of that question is, obviously, as you're building a tax credit property, you want to make sure that all these issues are dealt with on the front end. And some of these items can be very expensive if you don't do them right. And so a perfect example is if you have a ramp or a sidewalk up to the office and it is out of the slope requirements or slope ranges, then that's going to be a very expensive item to correct. On top of that, where I see the most issues that are expensive is when toilets are not 18 inches from the side wall. Toilets are very expensive to remove and move to an area that is in compliance. And so you don't want to have anything out of compliance as it relates to concrete or toilets. So be aware of those. But every single bit of the cost associated with making these properties both adaptable and even accessible can be done and part of the eligible and qualified basis.
Perfect. Another one, and I think this is one that comes up quite routinely and probably one of our favorite questions, but how many ADA units do you have to have?
I love, when I do these trainings live, I love to ask the audience, the first thing I love to ask is, how many ADA units do you have at your property? And you'd be surprised that probably 50 to 75% of the audience will raise their hand. Understand that, as I discussed earlier, ADA is for public accommodations only. Unless you are managing a dormitory at a public university or something that is governmentally owned, and tax credit properties are not governmentally owned, then ADA does not apply to your dwelling units. So that is a good question, though, and I've always liked when I can answer that question and clear that up.
Perfect. Another question that came in from one of the attendees: doesn't the state agency determine if the property is in compliance?
Well, you would make an assumption to that, but in my experience with just about everything, a single state agency, they've got a lot that they're having to work and worry about. They're worried about the compliance of the actual units and making sure that they're not down. They've got to make sure the files are correct. They've got to make sure that all the amenities that you promised on the application are actually there. And so surprisingly, the state agencies are not going to be going out there and doing an accessibility plan or a review of your accessible features. They are not going to determine whether you're in compliance. Now, they may come out every 3 years and they may have a checklist that says, check this and check that, but they don't have a clear understanding of that, or very few have a clear understanding of that. And so they'll come out and they will have findings. And in fact, one state agency that we've worked with put in a report a finding on their tax credit inspection that the sidewalk to the office appeared to be out of compliance and too great a slope. Now, when someone has a finding that says appears to be out of compliance, that tells me immediately that they are not understanding the regulations. Appears to is not a definitive answer. And so we went out, we had our inspectors go out to the property and determine through using a slope meter that the slope was not in fact out of compliance.
Perfect. Well, we are running up short on our 30 minutes and our lunch and learn here. So we wanted to, there are about 6 or 7 other questions. We will be answering those and putting those out to the attendees as well as on our site. I apologize if we did not get to that, but we wanted to deliver as much information as possible. We hope that you can join us for our HUD, our next webinar on HUD properties. So I know many properties have multiple layers of funding, but we wanted to make sure that we broke that down into our different webinar series. With that, that's going to be Tuesday next month in about 30 days, same time. Please register for that, as well as should you have questions you would like us to look at a project, or simply just want to know more information about our services or what Greg has covered here today, please reach out to us. Here, we are more than happy to help you and be your advocate. And finally, what everybody's been waiting for, my trusty hat. I've been popping in the names as they've come into our attendees, being able to do that. So I'm going to shuffle, try to make it as easy as possible for everybody. But we have Heather Lasker here with one of our attendees winning our $250 Amazon gift card. So we really appreciate everybody attending today. Once again, we will answer your questions, and if in the meantime, if you do have follow-up questions, please reach out. Our contact information is on the screen. Have a wonderful day. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today and making this world a little bit better for our residents and the residents that you all serve. Hope you all have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon and see you next month.